Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in world history. Today we're going to kick off the Renaissance. Our outcome is called the Renaissance in Italy, and this is really going to be a fun unit where we're going to look at some art and some sculptures and some different writers. We're also going to work in the Reformation as another part of this unit a little bit later on. So our first constructive response question for this unit says, summarize the Renaissance and identify why it started in Italy. When we summarize the Renaissance, we're going to give you a working definition of it today, but there's kind of a lot that goes into it. So we're actually going to be adding to that question as we progress through this unit. But we'll absolutely walk away from the lecture today understanding the three reasons why it started in Italy. So if we look at our roadmap for learning, what will we learn from all this? We're going to look at what is the Renaissance. We'll define that and sort of have a working definition for it. We'll talk about those three reasons why Italy, there's city-states, merchants, and really the access to Roman and Greek culture. And then we'll finish by looking at classical and worldly views. And really what that means is it's a little bit more about what came out of the Renaissance, what new movements the Renaissance ushered in. We're also going to talk about what it means to be a Renaissance man and a Renaissance woman. And that's how we'll wrap things up here today. So let's first connect back to the Middle Ages. We know the Middle Ages ends. A lot of historians agree that when England and France fought each other in the 100 Years' War, with the national pride that started to come out of the 100 Years' War for the French, the Middle Ages really had ended. So Europe is starting to take shape. Europe is starting to take shape with England, France, and even regions in Italy all evolving. Now, they don't look exactly like they do today. Obviously, there's still about 700 years of history that's going to shape Europe up until the modern day, but at least the feudal system in Europe is over. And so England, France, and Italy are starting to look like modern England, France, and Italy, at least in some regards. Of course, with that comes a revival of culture. And one of the things we're going to notice, and we're going to mention sort of under the umbrella of the Renaissance, this whole unit, is that education comes back. And when people are educated, they create. They make paintings, they make sculptures, they write books, they write things down. And all that helps provide culture and allows culture to spread. You're going to see a return to cities. Once the plague has moved through, people are going to feel safe about going back to cities, so we'll see that as well. And that's going to be really important. The Renaissance needs cities in order to actually happen. You're going to kind of see how that works through this as we progress. Of course, we have to mention the church is still very powerful. The Catholic Church dominated all life in Europe, really politically, socially, economically, of course, spiritually. Just like we had talked about in the Middle Ages unit, the church was really a big deal. And all this is going to, of course, let writers and artists begin to express new ideas and styles. And that's the most iconic feature of the Renaissance. There's so many different aspects to it, but it's the art and the literature that we study. We're going to look at painters like Da Vinci and Raphael and Michelangelo. We're going to look at writers like Dante and Boccaccio, even a little bit of Shakespeare in there once the Renaissance hits England. So certainly writers and artists really are the most iconic feature of this time period. So let's talk about what is the Renaissance. We sort of introduced that something's going to happen here. The Middle Ages are over. So let's really look at what this is all about. To understand the Renaissance, I think you have to know every aspect of this definition. It's a rebirth. In its core, that is what the Renaissance means. But when we add these following words, it starts to really have a substance. So it's a rebirth in art, writing, architecture, learning, and culture. Look at each one of those words individually. If you go back to the Middle Ages, we didn't have these things. Now, that's not to say people didn't create art or write things down or build things in the Middle Ages, because it did happen, but to a much smaller degree. So now we're going to have this big explosion of art and writing and buildings and people learning again, which is going to provide culture for all sorts of people. The Renaissance really was an explosion in all of those things. As people started to create again, as they started reading again and started learning again, their inspiration came from the past, as it typically does. So the educated hoped to bring back the life and the culture of classical Greece and Rome. Basically, if you talk to the educated class, and not all people were educated in the Renaissance, we have to remember that. We know most people weren't educated in the Middle Ages. In the Renaissance, some people start to learn to read and write again. But it doesn't apply to all people. And those who did have an education really revered the texts, the architecture, and the art of what the Greeks and the Romans had created. So that's where their inspiration is going to come from. In doing so, they created something entirely new, innovative styles of art and literature. Now we can look at art today and we go, oh wow, that looks realistic, or that kind of has a 3D effect because it uses a foreground and a background. Those were all techniques that were brand new at the time. So when we talk about innovative styles, these were paintings and sculptures that had never been created before. And that's hard for us to understand because we see people creating and painting all the time. Here in the Renaissance, the stuff that people created really was revolutionary. And when we look at our artists and our sculptors later on in this unit, you'll understand what I mean by that. The Renaissance eventually spread from northern Italy to the rest of Europe. That's going to take roughly 200 to 300 years to happen. That's why you end up getting Shakespeare involved, because Shakespeare's from England. He's not from Italy. So once the Renaissance spreads up to England, you start seeing the residual effects there in writing and things like that. So we're talking roughly about 1300 AD. And by the time the Renaissance had really spread throughout Europe, you're looking at about 1600. So about a 300-year period that the Renaissance exists. Now people didn't walk around going, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that this Renaissance is happening. They may have recognized life was a little bit better than their ancestors had, especially those who had maybe died of plague and things like that. But it wasn't like this Renaissance existed and people, had banners that said Renaissance and everything like that. So I want you to keep that in mind. So we want to look at 3 reasons why Italy was the place to be. So Italy had 3 distinct advantages. First of all, Italy had city-states. Now, if you remember, city-states are cities that operate like independent countries. And so Italy was not a unified country. It was a territory with all these different city-states. Part of the reason they had these city-states is because overseas trade, which was spurred on by the Crusades, had led to the growth of these large city-states. Thus, northern Italy was very urban, while the rest of Europe was still rural. That matters, because if you want to pay somebody to paint, you want to pay somebody to sculpt, you want to pay somebody to create something, you're going to do that in a city, not out in the countryside. And yes, all of these writers, all these sculptors, all these painters absolutely were paid to do so. They didn't just create things because they were geniuses. And yes, they were geniuses, but they didn't do so unless they were paid. And that's going to play into something I'm going to talk about here in a little bit called patronage. So cities were the place where people exchanged ideas and the site of an intellectual revolution. What I mean by intellectual revolution, this is where people could talk. This is where people could get together. This is where people could interact with one another and say, oh, I love that person's style. I love that type of painting. And then you would hire that person to create something for you. So cities, it had to happen in cities. Of course, survivors of the plague could demand higher wages. Think of it this way. All the people at Target die and you're the last Target employee. Now you're incredibly valuable. You're the one who's going to train all the new employees. You're the one who's going to help stock the shelves and things like that. So you better say, hey, you want to keep me around, you better pay me more. Well, a lot of people died of plague, certainly in the Middle Ages, and those who survived now were infinitely more valuable within society. So wages went up. Well, if people had higher wages, now they could afford art. They could afford to pay somebody to create a painting for them for their home or their castle or whatever. So wages going up is really a big part of this advantage that the city-states bring Italy. And then you had the merchant class. Merchants had few opportunities to expand their business because Italy's very tightly packed. So it's not like you franchised and built all these new businesses. What you did is you just profited from what you had. Now you had money to pursue art. And what we get out of that then, of course, is people paying each other to create. So here's the different city-states you can see of Italy. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but the one that's going to matter the most for us is Florence. Florence is the epicenter of the Renaissance. You saw that in engineering and empire, and that's where everything's really going to happen here in the early days of the Renaissance. There it is. The second reason that Italy is the place to be is because they have that merchant class, and one very famous banking family called the Medici family. So a wealthy merchant class developed in each of the Italian city-states. This is important because merchants were the ones with money. They started dominating politics. They were kind of involved in everything. Now, merchants are kind of interesting. They're not like kings. They did not inherit their social rank. This is pure economics at its best. They had to use their wits to survive. If you were a bad merchant, meaning you were a bad seller, you wouldn't survive. You'd go out of business. So the better you were at selling, the better you were at working with money, the more likely you would be successful. Now, what's kind of cool about this is this leads to the rise of the importance of individual merit. If you look at any painting or portrait today, one of the things you're going to see in common with all of them is they have a signature in the bottom. Well, the Renaissance is going to lead to this idea that I created this, it's mine, I should get credit for it. And that might be a painting, that might be a sculpture, that might be my merchant business. And so it started to get people to understand that the person creating this work of art is really a big deal. And so before that, we didn't give credit to the individual, but now we're going to do that. The Medici banking family really came to dominate Florence. They had branches all throughout Italy and Europe. And one of the most famous of the Medici family is Cosimo de' Medici. He was really the wealthiest European of his time. I mean, he had offices all over the place. He made a lot of money. And the Medicis are going to really influence a lot of our famous painters and sculptors by paying them to create works of art like Michelangelo and Da Vinci and things like that. So the Medici family is worth mentioning here. They had a lot of money, and they're going to help spur on the Renaissance. Grandson Lorenzo de' Medici, he became a great patron of the arts. Now, patron's an interesting word because patron is somebody who financially supports an artist or the arts, somebody who pays people to create. If I say, hey, I want a self-portrait made, you're a great artist, please paint me a picture of myself so I can hang it in my house, I'm a patron because I'm giving that person a job. I'm paying them to create. So now you have all these merchants in Italy who have money, who can pay people to create things. That's unique to Italy. That did not happen all over the rest of Europe. So that's the second reason why Italy is such a big deal. You have to have these merchants who become patrons, who who pay people to create art. I'm going to skip the slide there of Cosimo Lorenzo de' Medici because I'm running out of time here, but here we go. The last of the three big reasons for why Italy is the classical heritage of Greece and Rome. What do I mean by that? Well, again, we have to look at what the Renaissance educated really believed in. They thought the Middle Ages art and literature wasn't very good. So the Renaissance artists looked down on the art and literature of the Middle Ages. Instead, they wanted to revive the learning of the Greeks and the Romans. They looked at the Greek texts. They looked at the Roman texts. They said, they had it figured out. Let's be more like them. So let's skip over the history of the Middle Ages and let's go back to the classical period of the Greeks and Romans. And then when we say classical period, that's what we mean, the Greeks and the Romans. And so what this really means is the reason why Italy is a big deal is they got the ruins of Rome nearby. You want to go study the Romans, just you can go right to Rome. There, it's in Italy. So they had that advantage going for them as well. Of course, many Greek manuscripts had made their way to Rome via Christian scholars. So not only do you have the ruins of Rome, but you have a lot of things that the Greeks wrote because Christian scholars had brought them to Rome over the years. A lot of the Bible was written in Greek, so Greek was a pretty big deal at the time. So we're going to finish by looking at classical and worldly views. As scholars studied manuscripts, they became more influenced by classical ideas. And again, classical ideas mean the Greeks and the Romans. So this is going to lead to something called humanism. Humanism is an intellectual movement that focused more on human potential and achievements. Basically is the idea that humans can do stuff. We can create things, and we should get credit for what we create. And part of humanism was popularized by the study of history, literature, and philosophy. And all of those are known as the humanities. So it was very important to have a good background on all of those things if you were an educated person in the Renaissance. Of course, one of the other things about the Renaissance that really stands out is people really felt like they could enjoy life. People were so worried about offending God, but now you have these humanists come in and say, hey, you can live a good life. You survived the plague. You can enjoy life without offending God. So people said, hey, I can still be a Christian, and I can have nice paintings. I can have nice sculptures. I can eat good food, and I'm not going to be sinning. So that became a major cornerstone of the Renaissance as well. So an example is the wealthy could enjoy material luxuries, good food, and good music, and fine foods. All right, we're going to end here with the difference between a Renaissance man and a Renaissance woman. If you were to be considered a Renaissance man, you had to strive, or one who strove, to be a master in every area of study. So you're expected to be charming, you're expected to be witty, supposed to be well educated in the classics. You should also be a skilled rider, wrestler, and swordsman, so you have the physical aspect. And think about it, this is what we still do in school today. We want you to be smart, we want you to have, a good physical body. We go to Phi Ed class. We still believe in this Renaissance ideal today. Of course, for Renaissance women, it was a little different. Renaissance women, if you were upper class women should also know the classics, the Greek and Roman text, and be charming, but you were not expected to seek fame. So this is why you don't see a lot of really strong art coming out of any women in the Renaissance era, which is kind of sad. You could inspire art, but you could not create it. So you got kind of a difference here between a Renaissance man and Renaissance woman. And of course, women had very little influence in politics. All right, to finish things up, let's take another look at our constructive response question. The question says, summarize the Renaissance and identify why it started in Italy. Of course, when we summarize the Renaissance, we want to give our definition. And really the definition is rebirth, but we want to be more specific than that. So we've got a rebirth in art and architecture and learning and literature. There's so many different things that we see this explosion of at some point in time during the Renaissance. People are writing again, they're creating again, and that's a really big deal. We want to include humanism in that. So we definitely learned the definition of humanism, so we'll include that in our summary. We could talk about what it means to be a Renaissance man and a Renaissance woman. Men were supposed to strive to be experts in all areas of study. They're supposed to be skilled writers, readers and wrestlers, and really be able to do everything, which is really what our education system is based on today. And women were close, but of course women didn't have the same opportunities as men to create art. They could inspire art, but not create it. Certainly really not involved in politics either. But the last part of this question says identify why it started in Italy. The first one is that the Italians had city-states. Really, when you talk about trade coming through Italy via the Crusades, that's going to allow the Italians to develop trade networks, and especially develop our second reason, which is the merchants. The merchants have money. The merchants can become patrons of the arts. They can pay people to create. The last of the three reasons it started in Italy, we looked at the classical heritage of Greece and Rome. And really what that means is, in Italy, the ruins of Rome are nearby. The Romans once lived there. So if you want to study what they thought was the peak of Western culture, you'd study Roman culture. Also, the Romans had built a lot from the Greeks, so there's a lot of Greek and Roman manuscripts in the area as well. So it's kind of the perfect place to study what they thought were the perfect cultures, the Greeks and the Romans. So in the end, that's how we're going to answer that question. So that's going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.